everyone, we are from Group 4. And in this sketch opportunity, we will discuss about revolution, romanticism, and realism in the subject Western Cultural Civilization 1. Okay, let's meet our member. Okay, the first one is Alan, and then Linda, and then Rizal, and Lady, and Saviera, then Priscilia, and Merlina, and the last one is Berlian. Okay, the first one we will talking about the ideologies of change. Okay, the first one is liberalism. Although the conservative force were in the ascendancy from 115 to 130, powerful movements for change were also at work. This depended on ideas embodied in a series of political philosophies or ideologies that came into their own in the first half of 19th century. Liberalism. One of these ideologies was liberalism, which owed much to enlightenment of the 18th century and the American and French revolutions at the end of that century. In addition, liberalism became even more significant as the Industrial Revolution made rapid strides because the developing industrial middle class largely adopted the doctrine as its own. There were divergence of opinion among people classified as liberals, but all began with the belief that people should be as free from restraint as possible. This opinion is evident both in economic and political liberalism. Okay, the first one I want to talk about economic liberalism, also called classical economics. Economic liberalism had its primary tenet, the concept of laissez-faire, the belief that the state should not interrupt the free play of natural economic force, especially supply and demand. And in this case, government should not restrain the economic liberty of the individual and should not restrict itself to only three primary functions. The first one is defense of the country, then police protections of individuals, and the constructions and maintenance of public works too expenses for individuals to undertake. And then there are political liberalism. Politically, liberals come to hold a common sets of beliefs. Chief among them was the protections of civil liberties or the basic rights of all people, which included equality before the law, freedom of assembly, speech and press, and freedom from arbitrary arrest. All of these freedoms should be guaranteed by a written document, such as the American Bills of Rights or the French Declarations of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And then I want to talk about nationalism. Nationalism arose out of an awareness of being part of community that has common institutions, traditions, language, and customs. Nationalism did not become a popular force to change until the French Revolution. From then on, nationalists came to believe that each nationality should have its government. Nationalism threatened to upset the existing political order, both internationally and nationally. Okay, and then it's Linda Chen.
Okay, I would like to continue the presentation and talking about early socialism. So socialism is another ideology for change. Early socialism is actually the product of political theorists and intellectuals, and also the Marxists label the theorists as utopian socialists. Why? Because utopian socialists, they thought that a better environment for humanity could be achieved, but it's just utopia. And there are a lot of figures here. Charles Fourier is the founder of small model communities called phalansteries, and John Stuart Mill, his essay on liberty is viewed as a classic statement of the liberal belief in the freedom of individual. And other figures like Robert Owen, Louis Blanc, female and like female supporters and Flora Tristan. And then the prison reform. The increase in crime led to a rise in arrests. Initially, imprisonment is the only way to punish the arrested, but then the system is replaced with the American prisons system, in which the goal is to examine the prisoners' consciousness to gain a disciplined society. The next turn is Merlina, please.
The next is culture in age of reaction and revolution, the mood of romanticism. Okay, next. Okay, the characteristic of romanticism. So the first is romantics. A writer emphasized emotion, sentiment, and inner feelings in their works. An important model of romantic was the tragic figure of the sorrow of the young Werther. This is a novel by the Greek German writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. The story tells about Werther. He was a romantic figure who sought freedom in order to fulfill himself, but there is misunderstood, so he rejected by society. Then he continued to believe in his own worth through his inner feeling, but his deep love for a girl who did not love him finally led him to commit suicide. And then the next is individualism. Individualism is interest in the unique traits of each person. The romantic desire to follow their inner drive led them to rebel against middle class of convention. Long hair, bird, and outrageous clothes served to reinforce the individualism that young romantics were trying to express. And then the next characteristic is many romantics possess a passionate interest in the past. In the Germany, the Grimm brothers collect and publish local fairy tales, as did Hans Christian Andersen in Denmark. The revival of medieval Gothic architecture left European countryside adorned with pseudo-medieval castle and cities backed with grandiose cathedrals like city halls and then parliamentary building and even a railway station. And literature reflect historical consciousness. And then the next is the characteristic is attract to bizarre and unusual. In an exaggerate terms, this preoccupation give rise so-called Gothic literature. And then the next. Okay, the next is romantic books. The romantic books were viewed as seers who could reveal the invisible world to others. Their incredible sense of drama made some of them the most colorful figure of their era, living intense but short life. So the next is about love of nature. Romantic poetry gave full expression to one of the important characteristics of romanticism, love especially evident works towards bird. His experience nature was almost mystical, authentic, tiding of invisible things. And then the next is about the critique of science. The worship of nature also led Wordsworth and other romantic poets to critique the mechanistic materialism of 18th century science, which they believe had reduced nature to a cold object of study. Then emerging industrialization would cause people to become alienated from their inner self and natural world around them. Okay, so the next is Sefiaratre.
Okay, the next is Romanticism in art. Next slide. Okay, the Romantic artist had at least two fundamental characteristics. One is artistic expression. One is artistic expression. To them was a reflection of the artist in a feeling. A painting should mirror the artist's vision of the world and be the instrument of his own imagination. And then the second is romantic artists deliberately rejected the principles of classicism, and because the beauty was not a timeless thing and its expression depended on one's culture and one's age. Next slide. Okay, so These are the most famous Romanticism artists. First, the early life experiences of the German painter Caspar David Friedrich, with a lifelong preoccupation with God and nature. Friedrich painted landscape with an interest that transcended the mere presentation of natural details. For Friedrich, nature was a manifestation of divine life. To Friedrich, the artistic process depended on one's inner vision. Next. And another artist who dwelt on nature and made landscape his major subject was the Englishman Joseph Mulford William Turner. Turner was an incredibly prolific artist who produced more than 2,000 paintings, drawings, and watercolors. Turner's concern with and sunsets. He didn't idolize nature or reproduce it with realistic accuracy. However, he sought instead to convey its moods by using a skilled interplay of light and color to suggest natural effect. In allowing his object to melt into their surrounding, he anticipated the Impressionist painters of the second half of the 19th century. John Constable, a contemporary English Romantic painter, described Turner's painting as airy vision painted with detached steam. Next. The last is Eugene de Clairvaux, was the most famous French Romantic artist. Largely self-taught, he was fascinated by the exotic and had a passion for color, but both characteristics are visible in the death of Sardanapalus, which is his painting. The Clairvaux rejoiced in combining theatricality and movement with daring use of color. Many of his works reflect his own belief that a painting should be fit to eye. Next. And then we move to Romanticism in music. Next. Okay, too many romantic music was the most romantic of the arts because it enabled the composer to probe deeply into human emotion. Music historians have called in the 18th century the age of classicism and 19th century the era of romanticism. There was much carryover of classical forms from one century to the next. Next slide. Okay, this is the greatest composers in Romanticism. The first is Beethoven. During his first major periods of composing, his work was largely within the classical framework of the 18th century, and the influences of Haydn and Mozart are apparent. Beethoven broke through the elements of Romanticism in his use uncontrolled rhythm to create the dramatic struggle and uplifted resolutions. Beethoven went on to write a vast quantity of work, but in the midst of this productivity and growing fame, he was more and more burdened by his growing defeatedness. Next. And the second is Berlioz. Berlioz, achieving fame in Germany, Russia, and Britain, although the originality of his work kept him from receiving much recognition in his native France. Berlioz was one of the founders of program music, which was an attempt to use the mood and sound effect of instrument of program music was evident in his most famous piece. The first complete program symphony known as Symphonic Fantastic, Berlioz used music to evoke the passionate emotion of tortured love affair, including a fifth movement, and in which he musically creates an opium-included nightmare of witches gathering. Next. And then we move to the revival of religion in the age of Romanticism. The restoration of the nobility brought a new appreciation for the Catholic faith as a force for order in society. This the Romantic movement. And Catholicism, in particular, benefited from this romantic enthusiasm for religion as a faith. Catholicism echoed the harmony of all things. And the third is Protestantism. Germany witnessed a Protestant awakening as enthusiastic evangelical preachers found that their message of hellfire and their method of emotional conversation evoked a ready response among people alienated by highly educated establishment clergy of the state's crash. And the next is baby trends.
So I would like to present about the next subtopic. It's about industrialization and the Marxist response. First thing I would like to explain here is about industrialization on the continent. Industrialization arrived on the continent and in the United States later than in England, and developed its benefits and started in contrast to its explosive origins in Britain. In 1830, the British level of industrialization was twice that of France, and was 3 times the French level in 1860. All other countries, with the exception of the United States, had fallen even further behind. Not all other countries industrialization at the same time. Belgium, for instance, with large iron and coal deposits, adopted British technology quickly. Industrial development in France was slow and gradual, hardly revolutionary. By 1913, Germany was close to passing Great Britain, and the US already had. At the same time, the balance of the world, Latin America and Asia, tended to deindustrialize, leading to significant disparity between the developed and developing worlds. The second one is Britain had led industrial development and had an early lead over continental Europe, which was slow to adopt changes in technology until driven by British success. The French Revolution and other disturbances on the continent had disrupted trade, created runaway inflation, and led to anxiety among all classes. During the Napoleonic Wars, normal lines of communication between Britain and France were severed, the effect of which was to severely handicap efforts on the continent to adopt British technology and machinery. The years from 1789 to 1815, were a time of catastrophe for the French economy. The French have the opportunity to follow the British pattern. In the meantime, British manufactured goods had dominated the world market. Also, British technology and machinery had become so advanced that few engineers outside the British Isles even understood it. And after 1815, continental Europe stood up to the plate to face the challenge of Britain's economic empire. Continental nations had 3 advantages. The first one is continental European nations had a rich tradition of skilled urban artisans, putting out enterprises and merchant capitalism. This made it easy for their economies to adapt and survive in changing market conditions. The second one is continental capitalists did not have to undergo the trial and error method which has solved development in Britain. They simply had to borrow ideas from their British counterparts. The last one is France and Russia had strong independent governments which could and did use the power of the state to promote economic growth and eventually catch up with Britain. The next subtopic is about Marx and Marxism. There are 3 points here. The first one is in 1847. Marx and Engels joined a tiny group of primarily German socialist revolutionaries known as the Communist Linguist. So I would like to explain first about who is Marx and Engels. Marx was born into a relatively prosperous middle-class family in Trier in Western Germany. He descended from a long line of rabbis, although his father, a lawyer, had become a Protestant to keep his job. Marx enrolled at the University of Berlin in 1835, but his curious-minded free student wrestled with his father to send him to the more serious-minded University of Berlin, where he encountered the ideas of the German philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And Engels, the son of a wealthy German cotton manufacturer, had worked in Britain at one of his father's factories in Manchester. There he had acquired a first-hand knowledge of what he came to call the wage slavery of the British working classes, which he detailed in the conditions of the working class in England, a damning indictment of industrial life written in 1844. Angels would contribute his knowledge of actual working conditions as well as monetary assistance to the financially strapped Marx. The second point is in 1848, the resulting of Communist Manifesto, published in German in January, appeared on the eve of the Revolution of 1848. The resulting of Communist Manifesto, one would think from the opening lines of the preface that the pamphlet alone had caused this revolutionary upheaval. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exercise this spectre. Pope and Caesar, Metternich and Guizot, French radical and German police spies. In fact, the Communist Manifesto was known to only a few of Marx's friends, although its closing words were clearly intended to rouse the working classes to action. They passed unnoticed in 1848. The last one is idea of the Communist Manifesto. The feudal classes of the Middle Ages were the first to ask to the emerging middle class of our bourgeoisie. As the bourgeoisie took control in turn, its ideas become the dominant views of the era. So that's all from the subtopic Marx and Marxism. The next one is Ruby, presented by my friend.
And the next is Science and Culture in an Age of Realism. Between 1850 and 1870, the major intellectual development are evident. The growth of scientific knowledge with its rapidly increasing impact on the Western worldview, and the shift from Romanticism and its focus on the inner world of reality to realism and its turning toward the outer material world. The new age of science. By the mid-19th century, science was having an even greater impact on European life. The scientific revolution on the 16th and 17th centuries had fundamentally transformed the Western worldview and led to a modern, rational approach to the study of the natural world. Even in the 18th century, however, this intellectual development had remained the preserve of the educated elite and result in the few practical benefits. Moreover, the technical advance of the Industrial Revolution had depended little on pure science and much more on the practical experiment of technologically oriented amateur inventors. Advances in industrial technology, however, with an interest in basic scientific research, which in the 1830s and afterwards resulted in the rush of basic scientific discoveries that were soon converted into technological improvement that affected everybody. The development of the steam engine was important in encouraging scientists to work out its theoretical foundation, a preoccupation that led to thermodynamics, the science of the relationship between heat and mechanical energy. The law of thermodynamics were at the core of 19th century physics. In biology, the Frenchman Louis Pasteur formulated the germ theory of disease, which has enormous practical application in the development of modern scientific medical practice. See a revolution in healthcare. Later in his chapter in chemistry in the 1860s, the Russian Dmitry Mendeleev classified all the material elements now based on their atomic weight and provide the systematic foundation for the periodic law. The Englishman Michael Faraday discovered the phenomenon of electromagnetic induction and put together a primitive generator that laid the foundation for the use of electricity. Although economically efficient generators were not built until the 1870s. And the next is Carlos Darwin and the theory of organic evolution. Carlos Darwin in 1809 until 1882, like many of the great scientists of the 19th century, was a scientific amateur. Born into an upper middle class family, he studied theology at Cambridge University while pursuing an intense interest in geology and biology. In 1831, at the age of 22, his hobby became his vocation when he accepted an appointment as a naturalist to study animals and plants on an official Royal Navy scientific expedition aboard the HMS Beagle. The purpose was to survey and study the land masses of South America and the South Pacific. Darwin's specific job was to study the structure of various forms of plant and animal life. He was able to observe animals on islands virtually untouched by external influence and compare them with animals on the mainland. As a result, Darwin came to discard the notion of special creation and believed that animals evolved over time and in response to their environments. When he returned to Britain, he eventually formulated an explanation for evolution concerning natural selection, a theory that he presented in 1859 in his celebrated book on the origin of species using natural selection. The theory of evolution, the basic idea of Darwin's book, was that all plants and animals had evolved over a long. Darwin published his theory of organic evolution in 1859, followed 12 years later by The Descent of Man, in which he argued that human beings, like other animals, evolved from lower forms of life. The theory provoked a firestorm firestorm of criticism, especially from the clergy. One critic described Darwin's theory as a brutal philosophy. To wit, there is no God, and the abyss our Adam. Carlos Darwin and the Descent of Man. The main conclusion here arrived at, the now held by many naturalists who are well competent to form a sound judgment, is that man is descended from some less highly organized form. Okay, next will be presented by Andy.
Okay, the next is a revolution in healthcare. Next, the first is Pasteur, Koch, and germs. The breakthrough toward scientific medicine occurred with the discovery of microorganisms or germs as the agents causing disease. The germ theory of disease was largely the work of Louis Pasteur in 1922 until, I'm sorry, I mean 1822 until 1895. He was not a doctor, but a chemist. Pasteur's examinations of a disease threatening of the wine industry led to the development in 1863 of a process subsequently known as a pasteurization for heating a product to destroy the organism causing spoilage. So next is Robert Koch. Robert Koch in 1843 until 1910, a German physician took the study of bacteriology even further with his work on anthrax and tuberculosis. He discovered tuberculosis bacteria. Koch and his students identified the specific organism of at least 21 diseases, including gonorrhea, typhoid, pneumonia, meningitis, plague, and cholera. And then the next is the new surgical practices. By the end of 18th century, surgeons had already achieved a new professionalism, but the discovery of germs and the introductions of anesthesia created a new environment for surgical operations. Next. Okay, the next is anesthesia and modern surgery. Modern scientific medicine became established in the 19th century. Important to the emergence of modern surgery was the development of anesthetic agents that will block the patient's pain and enable surgeons to complete their surgery without the haste that had characterized earlier operations. This document is an eyewitness account of the first successful use of other anesthesia, which took place at the Massachusetts General Hospital in 1846. Yeah, and then the first one, new public health measures. Although the great discoveries of bacteriology came after the emergence of the first public health movement, they significantly further is its development. Based on the principle of preventive rather than himself voluntarily upon the table, which was to become the altar of future fame. The next one is the new medical schools. The new scientific developments also had an important impact on the training of doctors for professional careers in healthcare. The next one is women and medical schools. The unwillingness of medical schools to open their doors to women led to the formations of separate medical schools for women. The Female Medical College of Pennsylvania was the first in the US, and the London School of Medicine for Women was the first in Britain. Next, the next is science and the study of society. In the 19th century, the importance of science made it inevitable that the scientific approach would be applied to the realm of human activity. The attempt to apply scientific methods systematically to the study of society is perhaps most clearly seen in Comte's works. A system named positive knowledge was created by Frenchman Auguste Comte in 98 until 1857, and it is based on hierarchy of all the sciences. Mathematics is the foundation on which some fields are built, and sociology was at the top. Although his schemes were often complex and dense, Comte played an important role in the growing popularity of science and materialism in the mid-19th century. Okay, next one will be presented by my friends.
Okay, the next is realism in literature. The term realism was first employed in 1850 to describe a new style of painting and some spiritual literature. The literary realists of the mid-19th century were distinguished by their deliberate rejection of Romanticism. Literary realists want to deal with ordinary characters from real life and avoid sentimental language. The leading novelist is Gustav Flaubert in 1821 until 1880. Next. The next is realism in art. The realism art became dominant after 1850. Realism depicts the everyday life of ordinary people like peasants, workers, prostitutes, and then photograph realism and natural environment. The French led the realism painting. In this realism in art, the artist is Gustave Courbet in 1819 until 1870. This is the famous artist of realist school. And then Jean-Francois Millet in 1814 until 1875. Next. Next is music, the twilight of Romanticism. In the middle 19th centuries witnessed the development of a new group of musicians, namely New German School. This group of musicians emphasized emotional content. In this era, the musicians were famous in this era is Franz Liszt, and Richard Werner. Okay, next. Okay, I think that's all from our group, from group 4 about revolution, romanticism, and realism. Thank you for your attention.